Virginia and Tony Bennett are most known for the pack line defense, but on the offensive side of the ball, they have an equally as distinctive style of play they run year in and year out. It's called the blocker-mover offense and was popularized by Tony Bennett's father, Dick Bennett. It's part of the reason why Virginia plays so slow. Their offensive possessions currently last the second longest in the country this year, and they were the longest in the country last year. But beyond just the scheme, part of that slow tempo is simply just coaching preference. There have been other teams in the NCAA and NBA that run blocker-mover variations with much more tempo than Virginia. In this video, we'll look at some of those teams and assess the strengths and weaknesses of the offense. Look, Tony Bennett is one of the best coaches in the country and fantastic at teaching his system. The basic foundation of the blocker mover is hard to guard, and that's why you still see him running it today. But it was developed during a different time of basketball, when the understanding of spacing and usage of ball screens weren't the same as it is today. And personally, I think there are times when Virginia is running suboptimal offense due to some of those older concepts. Let's look at and understand the basic action, which is sometimes called wheel or circle action. You'll see Virginia run this repeatedly throughout a game. On one side, you have what's called a flare screen or back screen, and on the other side, you have a pin down or down screen. The two terms I'm going to use in this video are flare and pin. It gets more complicated than this, but at its core, Virginia is running these two actions over and over again, like in the motion of a wheel. The blocker-mover name is a reference to the two types of players on the court. There are two blockers, usually the two big men, who are screeners. And there are three movers, usually the guards, who are running off those screens. Generally speaking, the blockers and movers work in pairs, or sides, as Dick Bennett called it.
We take our two blockers, in this case they're probably bigger players, and put one on one side of the lane and the other on the other side of the lane. And basically we say to them, you own this side of the lane and you own this side of the lane. And we don't want you to cross. You may cross when you decide to screen for your partner, but we don't want you doing it on a regular basis. And by and large we say whenever the action is inside of you, meaning in the lane, we want you to pin the defense inside the lane. We find that one of the outcomes of that is if you can pin a man inside of the lane, it helps you to shape up in your posting action in deep in the lane where you really need to, and then you can work back to the lane side. If the action is outside of you, out in this way, we do not want the blocker in the lane to go out to the action. We want the action to come to the blocker. And again, sometimes the action will come to the blocker, go inside, and the blocker will pin down. So in the lane type blocking system, we have two blockers holding their sides up and down the lane. They can go as high as they need to or as low as they need to. And we have three movers who basically spread the floor, and they may move in any manner they want.
So here you can see that Clark and Salt are partners, and Jerome and Hunter are the other pair of partners. When Guy passes the ball to Jerome, now Guy and Salt would be working together as partners, and so would Clark and Hunter. But in this case it doesn't matter because Jerome scores off the pin. Inevitably, the blocker mover leads to a lot of creation and shots out of pin downs. We'll get to why the other action, the flare screen, doesn't lead to many shots later, but let's focus on the pin first. Ty Jerome is the best player on Virginia at creating offense off pins. Here, Towson is a step late and he makes them pay with a three. The blocker can roll to the hoop after setting the pin down. Jerome makes a great pocket pass to Salt. If the blocker can shoot from the outside, he can pop out to the three-point line. You'll see this little pivot and shovel pass that Jerome makes here from Virginia's movers a lot. And if the defender tries to shoot the gap and beat the mover to the spot, Jerome makes the right counter here by fading to the corner. My favorite part of Virginia's offense, and one of the things they do best, is what I call the boomerang pass off of a pin. Clark starts with the ball and Jerome is coming off the pin. The most common way for an opponent to help on this action is to have the man guarding Clark to do what's called jump to the ball once it's passed and provide help on Jerome. Jumping to the ball is how teams commonly guard Virginia. You will often hear opposing coaches yelling jump to the ball from the sideline. On this play, Virginia knows that's coming and will hit Clark on a boomerang pass as a counter to the jump to the ball. The blocker on the weak side will often set a flare screen that makes it even harder to defend the boomerang pass. There's only one team I can think of off the top of my head that used the boomerang concept more effectively than Virginia, and that's the Spurs. The Spurs didn't run blocker mover, but they ran a lot of pin downs and absolutely crushed opponents who jumped to the ball with boomerang threes. Like I said earlier, the blocker mover inevitably ends with a lot of pin downs, and sometimes that can look a little bit ugly when the opponent defends it well. If the mover comes off at the wrong angle or becomes too insistent on getting to the hoop, the spacing can break down and bad shots can get forced up. So now let's move on to the other action, the flare. Virginia doesn't get a huge amount of points off the flare, and it's pretty simple why. Here, Towson guards the flare how almost everyone does against Virginia. The big guarding the blocker, who's Jack Salt in this case, sags off and protects the hoop. That allows the guard guarding the mover to chase and not have to worry about the lob, because he has plenty of help. Salt isn't a shooter, so Towson can easily get away with this coverage. We'll get back to Virginia in a minute, but let's switch over to an NBA team that's heavily influenced by the blocker-mover concepts. Terry Stotts has run pin flare variations throughout his time at Portland. A few years back, the Trailblazers' offense even looked very similar to the Virginia wheel action. But there's a major difference to Portland's scheme. Not only do the Trailblazers incorporate more modern NBA concepts, but it makes it much harder to guard the flare screen. Here you can see the flare. Remember how I said most teams would guard Virginia? They would have Karl Anthony Towns sag all the way back and help on the lob. But with the Trailblazers, you can't do that because the blocker will immediately go set a ball screen in the middle of the floor for McCollum. Towns flinches for just a second to worry about the flare screen, and now he's late in his ball screen coverage. Even when the guy guarding the blocker, who in this case is Kenneth Faried, doesn't flinch, it's still good modern action because of the spacing. The Blazers have guards starting in both corners and a big in the dunker spot, with their playmakers coming off a high ball screen, ready to make a play. This flare screen, ball screen action is a common staple of high-level offenses because it's hard to guard. For example, you'll see it regularly in John Beilein's offense at Michigan, where he uses it to lead directly into spread ball screens. Going back to Virginia, the blocker mover was built when our understanding of ball screens and spacing were different. You will see ball screens from Virginia, but normally they are only partner ball screens. Clark and Hunter are partners here. When Clark catches the ball, Hunter will flip his hips and ball screen for Clark. But personally, I'd much rather see Jerome keep the ball, Let Clark flare to the corner and have Hunter sprint into a ball screen for Jerome. In making this video, I watched the vast majority of Virginia's half-court offense this season and found just one instance of the flare screen ball screen concept the Blazers use. Notice Huff sprinting to screen and the great spacing from Virginia. Because Virginia opponents usually sag off the blocker and prevent the lob off the flare, Virginia rarely ever even looks for it. Of all the film I watched, they never got the flare lob. This was the one time they made a real effort to at least look for it. Braxton Key thinks about making the pass here. Now compare that to the Blazers, who get points off the flare frequently. Watch the Jerome and Salt pairing here. Instead of the ball screen concepts that we saw from the Blazers, Virginia tends to become obsessed with re-screening. This all comes back to the original pairs philosophy of the blocker mover. Instead of using all 5 players on the court to create great spacing and gain an advantage, it sometimes feels like Virginia is just playing 2-on-2. Salt sets a flare screen, then immediately re-screens into a pin, then gets a post entry from Jerome, then kicks the ball right back to Jerome, then sets a step-up screen for Jerome. Virginia's good at this rescreening action. They've clearly been taught it well, but personally, I just think the pairs concept is a little outdated. It also looks a little ridiculous when the Virginia players aren't sure who their pairs are and try to run around to maintain the offense. You won't see many rescreens from Portland, especially over the last couple years. A lot of times they really only run the action as a way to loosen up and space for the high ball screen. It's technically the same action as Virginia, but with different goals and intentions. Let me be clear, I think Tony Bennett is one of the best coaches in the country. He has the best defensive track record of any coach in recent years, and it's not like the offense has been awful. In fact, there's been an encouraging trend of more three-point attempts and better spacing coming within the blocker mover scheme. So with that being said, let's end on a high note here with a counterplay that Bennett runs with a lot of success. Now that you know how the offense normally operates, it will make you appreciate the counter that much more. Jerome and Salt are partners, so if you're Maryland, you're expecting a flare screen and then maybe a rescreen. But instead, this is a called set play, and Jerome is going to take advantage of that expectation by temporarily forgetting about his pair. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please give it a like and follow me on Twitter for more college basketball analysis at HoopVision68.